For the entire duration of this conflict, Iran's Air Defense Command has organized its entire strategy around one specific fear: an American stealth platform reaching the airspace directly over Tehran itself, the capital, the seat of the regime, the one place Iranian officials have repeatedly and publicly insisted would never be violated the way border regions and remote military sites already had been. That assumption held for months. Strikes hit facilities in the provinces, hit coastal installations, hit underground sites buried in mountain ranges far from the capital. Tehran itself, ringed by some of the densest air defense coverage anywhere in the country, remained untouched, and Iranian officials pointed to that fact repeatedly as proof the capital's defenses were holding where it mattered most. Then, without a single public warning sign, without the kind of tanker buildup or readiness posture shift that analysts have learned to watch for throughout this conflict, radar and open-source flight trackers picked up an unmistakable signature directly over Tehran's own airspace. Iran's most sophisticated, most heavily layered air defense network, built specifically around the assumption that this exact scenario would never happen, did not intercept it. I'm going to walk you through what actually appeared over Tehran, how it managed to arrive there without any of the warning signs. This conflict has trained us to expect what Iran's own air defense failure tells us about the true state of the capital's protection, and why the specific platform involved may represent the single most consequential capability demonstration of the entire war. Stay with me, because there's a detail about exactly what this platform was doing over the capital, not simply flying through it, that changes the entire read on this incident. Before I walk you through the sequence, I want to be upfront about how I'm approaching a story this sensitive, because an incident directly over a national capital, especially one involving a capability this significant, tends to produce enormous amounts of unverified claims within hours, and separating confirmed fact from speculation is the entire reason I do these breakdowns the way I do. My background is in air power, stealth technology, and integrated air defense systems, specifically how a capital's defense architecture is built, layered, and tested, and what it actually means when that architecture fails to intercept something it was specifically designed to stop. That's the lens I'm bringing to this video. Where something is confirmed by multiple independent trackers or officials, I will say so plainly. Where it remains genuinely unconfirmed or disputed among serious analysts, I will tell you that too, clearly, rather than presenting a guess as settled fact. Let's get into what we actually know. To understand why this incident is being treated as such a significant moment, you first need to understand exactly how seriously Iran is invested in defending its capital specifically, separate from how it defends the rest of the country. Tehran sits at the center of Iran's most concentrated air defense coverage, layered with multiple generations of surface-to-air missile systems, some domestically produced, some acquired from allies, arranged specifically to create overlapping fields of coverage that are supposed to make it exceptionally difficult for any single aircraft, manned or unmanned, to penetrate the capital's airspace undetected and unengaged. This is not a casual defensive posture. Protecting the capital, the seat of the regime's political and military leadership, has been treated as the single highest priority in Iran's entire national air defense architecture for decades, well before this current conflict began. Precisely because Iranian planners have always understood that a hostile aircraft operating freely over Tehran represents a uniquely damaging blow to the regime's credibility, far beyond the physical damage any single strike could produce. That layered defensive concept is worth explaining in a bit more detail, because it's exactly what makes this incident so significant. A modern integrated air defense network built around a capital city typically operates in concentric rings, with longer-range systems positioned to detect and engage threats well before they approach the city itself. Medium-range systems providing a second layer of coverage closer in, and short-range point defense systems protecting the most critical individual sites within the city as a final layer, in case everything else fails. The entire logic of this architecture depends on redundancy, the assumption that even if one ring fails to detect or engage an incoming threat, at least one of the other layers will catch it before the threat reaches its target. Iran has spent years and a considerable share of its defense budget building out exactly this kind of layered coverage around Tehran specifically, integrating radar systems, command and control infrastructure, and multiple generations of interceptor missiles into a single coordinated network. A penetration that gets through every single layer of that architecture without triggering so much as a publicly confirmed detection, let alone an intercept attempt, is not simply a single system failing. It represents the failure or the successful defeat of an entire integrated architecture built specifically to prevent exactly this outcome. That priority has only intensified since this conflict began, as strikes against provincial military sites, coastal installations, and underground facilities accumulated over the preceding weeks. Iranian state media consistently emphasized, whenever addressing the broader trajectory of the war, that Tehran's own airspace remained fully secure, using that claim as a form of reassurance to a domestic population that had already absorbed months of unsettling news about facilities elsewhere in the country being struck. Regional analysts tracking Iranian domestic messaging throughout this conflict noted that this specific claim, the capital remains untouched, functioned as one of the regime's primary reassurance narratives, repeated frequently enough that it had effectively become a kind of psychological red line in Iranian public messaging, separate from any specific military assessment of what Tehran's defenses could or could not actually stop. This is exactly why the incident we're discussing today lands as such a significant moment, independent of whatever the platform involved was actually doing once it arrived. An unmistakable presence in Tehran's own airspace directly contradicts the single reassurance narrative the regime had leaned on most heavily throughout this entire conflict, and it does so not through a claimed or disputed incident that Iran could plausibly deny or minimize, but through open-source tracking data and radar signatures that multiple independent observers picked up more or less simultaneously, making this a considerably harder incident for Iranian officials to manage through the kind of ambiguous, minimizing public statements that have worked for them in some previous incidents throughout this conflict. Let's walk through the sequence as it has been pieced together. Aviation trackers who monitor military flight activity across the region, along with several independent radar data aggregators that compile publicly broadcast signals from a range of sources, began reporting an unusual signature over Tehran's own airspace within a narrow window that multiple sources have placed at just before dawn local time. What made this signature notable from the very first reports was not simply its location, directly over the capital, but the complete absence of any corresponding activity on the kind of supporting infrastructure trackers have learned to watch for throughout this conflict. No unusual tanker movement in the preceding days, no readiness posture shift at American bases in the region that satellite and flight trackers typically pick up before a significant mission. No gap in routine tracking data of the kind that has preceded other major strikes we've covered on this channel, where analysts could at least retroactively identify a precursor pattern even if they couldn't predict the target in advance. This time, there was essentially nothing beforehand. The first indication anyone outside a small circle of officials had that something significant was happening was the signature over Tehran itself, appearing without warning in the one location Iran had spent this entire conflict insisting was secure. That absence of any detectable buildup is the first major clue about what platform was actually involved, and it points toward one specific answer more strongly than any other. A conventional strike package, even one using stealth bombers, typically requires enough supporting logistics, refueling, coordination, positioning of support aircraft, that some trace usually becomes visible to a sufficiently attentive tracking community, even when the core strike aircraft itself remains successfully hidden. A signature that appears with essentially zero detectable precursor activity is far more consistent with a platform requiring minimal or no external logistical support to reach its target, which points strongly toward either an extremely long-range, fully autonomous unmanned platform launched well outside the region entirely, or a next-generation stealth capability sufficiently advanced that its radar and infrared signature management defeated not just Iran's air defense radar, but the broader open-source detection network that has successfully picked up on every other major stealth mission throughout this conflict. Several defense analysts who reviewed the available radar and tracking data in the hours after the incident converged on a similar read. The characteristics of the signature, its extremely limited radar cross-section, the absence of any detectable communications or telemetry activity consistent with a manned aircraft's normal support requirements, and its ability to operate over one of the most heavily defended airspaces in the entire country without triggering an effective intercept, are most consistent with an advanced unmanned stealth platform rather than any previously confirmed manned aircraft type involved in this conflict. That assessment remains officially unconfirmed by any government source, and I want to be direct with you that anyone claiming certainty about the exact platform involved, down to a specific program name, is going further than the available public evidence currently supports. What can be said with real confidence is that whatever this platform was, it represents a meaningfully different category of capability than anything Iran's air defense network has been tested against up to this point in the conflict. It's worth understanding briefly why an unmanned platform specifically would be capable of the kind of near-total invisibility this incident demonstrated, in a way that even the B-2 missions we've covered on this channel have not quite matched. A manned stealth bomber, however sophisticated its airframe and radar-absorbing design, still requires a pilot, a crew, life support systems, and the broader logistical footprint that comes with sending human beings on an extremely long-range mission, all of which create additional signatures, thermal, electromagnetic, and logistical, that a sufficiently patient and well-resourced tracking effort can sometimes pick up on. An advanced unmanned platform removes several of those signatures entirely. No life support systems generating detectable heat signatures beyond the aircraft's own propulsion. No requirement for the kind of extended aerial refueling support a human crew's endurance limits would otherwise necessitate if the platform is designed with sufficient range and efficiency to make the trip without it. No communications traffic beyond whatever minimal, highly encrypted control links the mission actually requires. And increasingly, next-generation unmanned platforms are designed to operate with a significant degree of pre-programmed autonomy, specifically to minimize even that limited signature. Strip away enough of those secondary signatures, and what's left is a platform that can, at least in principle, approach something close to a true radar and infrared ghost, exactly the profile this incident appears to describe. This is not a purely theoretical category of technology. Defense programs across multiple countries, the United States prominent among them, have spent years developing exactly this class of long-range, low-observable unmanned platform systems designed specifically for the kind of deep penetration missions that would put a human pilot at unacceptable risk, or that benefit enormously from the reduced signature an unmanned design makes possible. Most of the specific technical details of these programs remain highly classified for obvious reasons, which is exactly why an incident like this one, if it does represent an operational deployment of this kind of capability, is treated with such intense interest by analysts who have spent years watching for exactly this kind of debut without having any concrete confirmation of when or how it might actually happen. Now here's the detail I mentioned at the top of this video that changes the entire read on this incident. Initial coverage in the hours immediately following the sighting largely framed this as a reconnaissance or demonstration overflight, a capability signal rather than an operational strike, on the theory that a platform this valuable and this sensitive would not be risked on a strike mission when its mere undetected presence over the capital already sent an unmistakable message on its own. Follow-up satellite imagery, however, tells a more complicated story. Commercial satellite passes over a specific facility on Tehran's outskirts, a site associated with elements of Iran's air defense command and control infrastructure, rather than a purely symbolic or civilian target, show what analysts describe as fresh, precise damage consistent with a small number of extremely accurate strikes. Not the kind of large-scale destruction associated with a conventional bomber strike, but damage narrowly concentrated on specific structures analysts believe are tied to radar and command coordination functions, rather than the broader facility around them. In other words, this was very likely not purely a demonstration flight. Something specific, tied directly to the very air defense architecture that failed to intercept it, appears to have been deliberately targeted and struck during this overflight, a detail that considerably raises the stakes of what this incident actually represents. If that assessment holds up, and I want to be clear that the precise details are still being pieced together by independent analysts rather than confirmed by any official statement, this incident stops looking like a symbolic capability demonstration and starts looking like something considerably more calculated. A platform capable of penetrating Tehran's own airspace undetected, used specifically to strike a piece of infrastructure directly connected to the very defense network, meant to stop exactly this kind of intrusion. That is a different category of message than simply proving a platform can reach the capital. It is a demonstration that the platform can reach the capital and specifically degrade the system responsible for defending it in a single mission, without triggering the kind of broader retaliatory dynamic a strike against a more obviously civilian or symbolic target inside the capital would almost certainly have produced. There's a layer of tactical logic worth unpacking here, because the specific target selection tells its own story independent of the platform involved. Striking the air defense command and control infrastructure itself, rather than a more prominent political or military symbol elsewhere in the capital, accomplishes something a more dramatic target would not. It degrades Tehran's ability to detect and respond to any potential follow-up activity, while simultaneously demonstrating that even the system's own nerve center, the infrastructure specifically responsible for coordinating a citywide defensive response, was not safe from whatever platform carried out this mission. That is, in a narrow but strategically meaningful sense, a more sophisticated message than simply striking a larger, more visible target would have sent, because it directly undermines the specific mechanism Tehran would need functioning at full capacity if a larger, more significant strike were to follow. Let's talk about what Iran's own defense failure here actually tells us, because this is arguably the most strategically significant part of the entire incident, independent of what the platform involved turns out to be. Iran's air defense architecture around Tehran includes multiple overlapping systems specifically designed to create redundancy, on the theory that even if one system fails to detect or intercept a given threat, another layer should catch it. A platform that penetrated that entire layered system without triggering a publicly confirmed intercept attempt at any level suggests either a genuinely significant leap forward in stealth or electronic warfare capability on the American or Allied side. A platform that penetrated that entire layered system without triggering a publicly confirmed intercept attempt at any level suggests either a genuinely significant leap forward in stealth or electronic warfare capability on the American or Allied side. Distinguishing between those explanations matters enormously for understanding what this incident actually predicts about the rest of the conflict. And right now, credible analysts are genuinely split on which factor deserves more weight. The case for a genuine capability leap rests on the sheer completeness of the apparent penetration, an outcome that would be difficult to explain purely through degraded Iranian readiness, since even a meaningfully weakened air defense network built around this much redundancy would typically be expected to at least attempt some kind of detectable response. A radar lock, an interceptor launch, some public indication that the system tried and failed rather than never engaging at all. The case for degraded Iranian readiness rests on the accumulated toll of months of sustained conflict, including previous strikes against air defense-adjacent infrastructure elsewhere in the country, sanctions-driven maintenance and technical support, shortfalls that would disproportionately affect exactly the kind of sophisticated radar and interceptor systems Tehran's defense relies on, and the broader strain on trained personnel and equipment readiness that a prolonged, multi-front conflict tends to produce even in a well-resourced military. Most analysts who have weighed in publicly on this incident suggest the true explanation likely involves both factors reinforcing each other, rather than either one operating in isolation, a genuinely more capable platform arriving at a moment when Iran's defensive readiness was already meaningfully degraded by the cumulative effects of this conflict, producing a result more complete than either factor would likely have produced entirely on its own. State media acknowledged unusual activity in the capital's airspace without directly confirming the nature or scale of what occurred, emphasizing instead that Tehran's air defenses remain fully operational, and describing the incident, without specifics, as consistent with routine defensive posture rather than a failure to intercept a genuine threat. That framing sits in obvious tension with the underlying reality that something was detected over the capital, and no publicly confirmed intercept attempt followed a tension that domestic Iranian audiences, many of whom have access to the same open-source tracking information analysts around the world are using, are almost certainly capable of noticing themselves, regardless of how carefully official messaging tries to manage the narrative. This is precisely the kind of incident that is considerably harder for a government to fully control the story around than a strike against a remote facility hundreds of miles from the capital, simply because so many more people, officials, journalists, and ordinary residents alike were in a position to notice something unusual happening directly overhead. Let's pull back and talk about what this incident means for the broader trajectory of the conflict, because an incident of this significance rarely stays contained to a single strategic lesson. First, and most directly, this represents a serious blow to the specific reassurance narrative Iran has leaned on throughout this entire war, that the capital itself remains a secure, untouchable space regardless of what happens elsewhere in the country. That narrative mattered enormously for domestic morale and regime stability, arguably more than any single military facility elsewhere in the country, precisely because it drew a psychological line between the war happening in the provinces and the immediate safety of the seat of government itself. An incident that crosses that line, especially one that appears to have specifically targeted the very system meant to prevent it, removes a psychological buffer that Iranian leadership has relied on for months, and the domestic political consequences of that shift may end up mattering as much as the physical damage to whatever facility was actually struck. Second, this incident forces a genuine reassessment of Iran's remaining strategic options for the rest of the conflict. If Tehran's own air defense network, built specifically around layered redundancy and treated as the highest national defense priority, can be penetrated this completely, every other, less heavily defended site in the country has to be considered even more vulnerable by comparison. That includes facilities Iran may have assumed carried some additional margin of safety, simply by virtue of being defended by systems modeled on or connected to the same architecture, protecting the capital. A single incident like this one has a way of collapsing multiple layers of assumed protection simultaneously, not just at the specific site involved, but across every facility that shared some meaningful connection to the defensive assumptions this incident just directly contradicted. Every facility we've covered on this channel throughout this conflict, the coastal installations, the underground mountain complex, the naval formation in the Strait of Hormuz, ultimately depended on some version of the same broader assumption Iran built its entire national defense architecture around, that a combination of concealment, hardening, distance from the capital, or layered defensive coverage would provide a reliable margin of protection against the full range of capability an adversary might actually bring to bear. This incident, more than any single strike we've covered previously, directly tests the strongest version of that assumption, the version built around Iran's own capital and its most heavily resourced defensive architecture, And the outcome suggests that margin of protection may be considerably thinner across the board than Iranian planners have spent years assuming it to be. Third, and this is the part that extends well beyond Iran specifically, a demonstrated capability of this kind carries enormous signaling value to every other government in the world that has invested heavily in layered, redundant air defense architecture around its own most sensitive locations, on the theory that sufficient redundancy provides a reliable guarantee against exactly this kind of penetration. There's also a question worth addressing directly about escalation risk, because an incident this significant directly over a national capital inevitably raises the question of whether this represents the kind of threshold crossing event that could trigger a considerably more severe response than incidents at more remote sites have produced so far. Several analysts have pointed out that the apparent restraint of the strike itself, narrowly targeting specific air defense adjacent infrastructure rather than broader civilian or symbolic targets within the capital, suggests a deliberate attempt to demonstrate capability and inflict a meaningful, specific blow while avoiding the kind of broader devastation that would almost certainly force an immediate, large-scale Iranian response regardless of the regime's weakened position. That reading, if accurate, suggests this incident was designed specifically to sit just below the threshold that would force an uncontrollable escalation spiral while still delivering a message considerably more severe than anything achieved by strikes against Iran's provincial or coastal infrastructure earlier in this conflict. Whether Iran's own leadership reads the incident the same way, as a calculated, bounded message rather than an opening move toward a broader assault on the capital itself, is likely to shape the regime's response over the coming days in ways that are, right now, genuinely difficult to predict with confidence. That calibration, striking hard enough to send an unmistakable message while staying narrow enough to avoid forcing an uncontrollable response, is an exceptionally difficult balance to get right, and it's worth acknowledging just how much can go wrong even with the most careful targeting decisions. Precision strikes rely on accurate, current intelligence about exactly what a given facility contains, and how central it actually is to the broader defense networks. And even a small miscalculation, striking a facility that turns out to have greater symbolic or practical significance than analysts initially assessed, can shift how a targeted government perceives and responds to an otherwise carefully calibrated strike. The fact that Iran's public response so far has remained relatively restrained, rather than escalating immediately toward the kind of maximalist retaliatory rhetoric the regime has used after some other incidents in this conflict, is itself a meaningful early indicator that the calibration here may have succeeded as intended, though that pattern could still shift considerably as more information about the strike's true scope becomes available to Iranian leadership over the coming days. It's also worth considering how this incident is likely to be studied by military planners well beyond the immediate context of this specific conflict, because the technical questions it raises extend into areas that matter for how modern warfare is likely to be fought for years to come. If this incident does confirm the operational debut of a genuinely next-generation stealth or electronic warfare capability, understanding exactly how it managed to defeat both Iran's layered air defense and the broader open-source tracking community that has successfully identified nearly every other major mission throughout this conflict, becomes one of the most closely studied technical questions in modern air power, not just among Iran's own defense planners, but among every government maintaining or developing its own advanced air defense systems. Capabilities of this kind tend to reshape defense investment priorities globally once their existence and effectiveness become clear, well beyond whatever immediate strategic effect they produce in the specific conflict where they were first demonstrated. This dynamic has played out repeatedly throughout the history of air power, where a single demonstrated capability, whether it was the first operational use of a genuinely stealthy aircraft decades ago, or a new generation of precision-guided munitions in a different conflict entirely, has reshaped how every major military in the world thought about its own defensive investments for years afterward, regardless of whether that military had any direct stake in the specific conflict where the capability first appeared. A capital-penetrating stealth capability of this kind, if confirmed, is likely to follow exactly that pattern. Governments that have invested heavily in layered air defense architecture around their own capitals and most sensitive sites, believing that sufficient redundancy provides a reliable guarantee against exactly this kind of penetration, now have a concrete, real-world data point suggesting that assumption may be less reliable than their own planning has assumed, and defense budgets and research priorities in multiple countries are likely to shift, at least incrementally, in response to exactly this kind of demonstrated outcome. Let me bring this down to what actually matters here beyond the strategic and technical analysis. For months, the psychological core of how Iran's leadership, and by extension, much of the Iranian public, understood this conflict rested on a specific, repeatedly reinforced assumption that whatever happened elsewhere in the country, Tehran itself remained a fundamentally secure space, protected by the most sophisticated defensive architecture the regime could build. That assumption did not simply weaken with this incident. It was directly, publicly, and undeniably contradicted in a way that neither official messaging nor the passage of time is likely to fully undo, regardless of exactly what platform was involved, regardless of the precise scale of the damage at whatever facility was actually struck. The core fact that will likely define how this incident is remembered is considerably simpler and more significant than any of the technical details. For the first time in this entire conflict, something reached the skies directly over Tehran, and nothing stopped it. Before you go, I want to ask you two things directly. First, if this breakdown gave you a clearer, more careful picture of what actually happened over Tehran than the shorter clips and dramatic headlines circulating elsewhere, share it with one person who's trying to make sense of this conflict. That's genuinely the only way analysis like this reaches people, instead of getting buried under louder, less careful content. Second, I want your read in the comments. Do you think this represents the debut of a genuinely new stealth capability? Or do you think it's primarily a story about how much Iran's air defense readiness has degraded after months of sustained conflict? And do you think a strike this close to the seat of the regime itself makes a major escalation more likely in the days ahead? Or do you think the apparent restraint of the target selection here suggests both sides are still trying to avoid crossing that particular line? Drop your assessment below. I read every one of them, and if this video delivered real value for you, a like helps it reach the people who need a clear-headed breakdown instead of speculation. Here's where this stands. An advanced platform, very likely an unmanned stealth aircraft based on the near-total absence of detectable supporting activity beforehand, appeared directly over Tehran's own airspace without warning, penetrating Iran's most heavily layered, highest priority air defense network, without triggering any publicly confirmed intercept attempt. Follow-up satellite imagery indicates the incident was not purely a demonstration overflight, but involved a precise, narrowly targeted strike against infrastructure connected to Iran's own air defense command and control system, the very network responsible for stopping exactly this kind of intrusion. Analysts remain genuinely divided over whether this outcome primarily reflects a significant new leap in stealth or electronic warfare capability, a meaningful degradation in Iran's own defensive readiness after months of sustained conflict, or some combination of both factors reinforcing each other, and Iran's own muted, ambiguous public response has done little to resolve that uncertainty. What is clear, regardless of the precise technical explanation, is that the single reassurance narrative Iran's leadership has relied on most heavily throughout this entire war, that the capital itself remained secure, no matter what happened elsewhere in the country, has been directly and publicly contradicted, with implications for domestic morale, for how every other facility connected to the same defensive architecture is now assessed, and for how every government watching this conflict closely is likely updating its own assumptions about what layered air defense can actually guarantee in the modern era. Stay locked in on this one, because how Iran responds to having its own capital's defenses broken, this cleanly may shape the next, and possibly most dangerous phase of this entire conflict.